The photograph was taken for a newspaper feature that never ran. I found it in a cardboard box at an estate sale in New Jersey, tucked between pictures of weddings and birthdays and the ordinary accumulations of a life lived far from the spotlight. The image showed a young woman, no more than 25, standing at an industrial workbench, wearing factory coveralls and a simple kerchief, holding something so small and unremarkable that at first I couldn't identify it. Just metal, just geometry, just a modest object that appeared to weigh nothing at all. The photograph was dated April 1940, printed on thin wartime paper that had yellowed into the color of old parchment. On the back, in careful handwriting, Dorothy Chen, Lockheed Burbank Division. Her idea. Nobody listened. I almost threw it away. It seemed like the kind of industrial documentation that archives were already drowning in. Photographs of factory workers, records of wartime production, images that had been deemed historically insignificant and forgotten accordingly. But something made me stop. Maybe it was the date. Maybe it was the way Dorothy's hands held that metal object. Not with pride, but with a kind of quiet certainty, as if she already knew that what she was holding would matter more than anyone would ever acknowledge. I began researching. Dorothy Chen, factory worker, Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, Burbank Division, 1940. The searches yielded almost nothing. A few patents filed under her name. A brief mention in an obscure technical journal. A single paragraph in a 1985 oral history project that had been archived and then abandoned. Dorothy Chen had existed, had worked, had invented, and had then disappeared from the historical record so completely that it was as if she'd never been there at all. But the more I dug, the more a story emerged. Fragments of it, pieces scattered across decades, hidden in technical documentation and military records, and the memories of engineers who were themselves now dead or dying. Dorothy Chen hadn't just invented something. She'd invented something that would save lives, thousands of lives. The kind of invention that changes the trajectory of wars, that alters the mathematics of survival, that proves that genius isn't always dressed in prestige and doesn't always arrive with fanfare. I tracked down her family. Her grandson, Robert Chen, now in his 60s, agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Los Angeles, not far from the Lockheed facility where his grandmother had worked 80 years before. He arrived carrying a leather bag containing 3 things: a photocopy of the original patent, a handwritten journal, and the actual device that Dorothy had invented, a small metal piece, no more than 4 inches long, constructed from aluminum and steel, so modest and simple that it would have been easy to miss its significance if you didn't know what you were looking at. Nobody wanted to hear about her, Robert said without preamble. My grandmother was Chinese. She was a woman. She was a factory worker, not an engineer. She had no degree, no credentials, no name that carried weight in the aerospace industry. She had an idea, and that idea was worth 50 cents to manufacture and thousands of lives to save. But the system wasn't interested in giving credit where credit was due. He placed the device on the table between us. It looked almost like a valve, but simpler, more elegant. A perfect marriage of form and function. The metal had been polished smooth by time and handling, the edges precise, the craftsmanship evident even decades later. It was the kind of object that felt right in your hand, balanced, purposeful, designed by someone who understood not just engineering but the poetry of mechanical elegance. This saved 2,100 pilots, he said quietly. That's the documented number. That's how many men didn't burn to death in their aircraft because this 50-cent piece of metal prevented fuel line ruptures during violent maneuvers. But nobody knew about it. Nobody knew about her. I stared at the device, understanding finally why that photograph had stopped me, why Dorothy's hands held it with such quiet certainty. She had known. She had always known that what she was holding mattered. She had lived with the knowledge that she had solved a problem that nobody else could solve, that she had created something that would preserve lives, and that the world would never acknowledge her for it. I realized then that this wasn't just a story about invention. This was a story about erasure. This was a story about how history forgets the people who matter most, how systems of power conspire to render invisible those who don't fit the approved narrative of heroism. This was a story about a woman who stood in a factory in 1940, holding a 50-cent piece of metal, knowing that she had changed the war, knowing that she would probably never receive credit for it, and doing it anyway. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he held the coupling. It was clear that he carried his grandmother's story like a sacred trust, understanding its weight, understanding what it meant that she had sacrificed recognition for impact. He had dedicated decades to researching her history, compiling documentation, trying to ensure that when the truth finally emerged, it would be complete and irrefutable. "My whole life," Robert said, "I've been trying to answer one question. Why did she let him take it? Why didn't she fight? Why didn't she claim what was hers? And I finally understand now, after all these years of research and reflection, that I was asking the wrong question. The real question isn't why she didn't fight for credit. The real question is what kind of person chooses to let themselves be erased so that others can live? What kind of courage does that require? That's the invention I'm really trying to understand." The real investigation was just beginning, and I knew that before I finished, I would have to understand not just what Dorothy invented, but why the system had been so determined to forget that she'd ever existed. I would have to trace the pathways of erasure, the mechanisms of institutional amnesia, the ways that power operates to silence certain voices while amplifying others. And I would have to come to terms with the uncomfortable truth that all of us, in various ways, participate in these erasures through our silence, our acceptance of official narratives, our unwillingness to dig deeper into the stories we've been told. The patent documents told a story that the official records had tried to hide. I obtained the original filing from the U.S. Patent Office. Dorothy Chen's application, dated September 1940, filed under the category of aircraft safety equipment. The description was technical, precise, written in language that suggested she understood not just the mechanics of what she'd invented, but the engineering principles underlying it. A modified fuel line coupling mechanism designed to prevent rupture and leakage during extreme G-force maneuvers, the patent read, particularly applicable to high-performance military aircraft. The design employs a flexible metallic joint that allows for stress absorption while maintaining structural integrity and fuel system integrity across the full operational envelope of combat aircraft. But here's where the story became strange. The patent was approved, filed, recorded in the official registry, and then almost immediately classified. Not secret, not in the way military documents were classified, but classified in a different way. It was filed under her name, but the credit line listed a man named Dr. James Patterson, chief engineer at Lockheed. The description of the innovation was credited to the Patterson Fuel Line Initiative. Dorothy Chen was mentioned only once, in a subordinate clause. Developed with input from factory personnel. Robert showed me the documentation with an expression of quiet rage that had clearly been decades in the making. His hands shook as he turned the pages, pointing out the crucial details, the shift in terminology, the subtle linguistic moves that transformed Dorothy from innovator to contributor, the way that official language had the power to rewrite reality. "She invented it," he said. He took the credit. "It's that simple. She understood fluid dynamics, stress points, aircraft behavior under extreme conditions. She'd been studying aircraft design on her own time, at night, working as a factory assembler during the day. She had figured out the problem that all the credentialed engineers couldn't solve. So she built a prototype using scrap metal from the factory floor. Cost 50 cents, changed everything." "How did Patterson take credit?" I asked. "She showed him the prototype," Robert said. "She was trying to get it to someone important, someone who could make a decision about implementation. Patterson saw it, recognized what it was immediately, understood the implications, and instead of helping her get it to the right people, he just took it. He filed it under his name, made minor modifications to the design, changes that actually made it slightly less efficient, and submitted it through official channels. I examined the two versions of the patent side by side. Dorothy's original design was elegant in its simplicity, a flex joint that could absorb G-forces while maintaining fuel line integrity. Patterson's improved version added unnecessary complexity, included components that weren't required, and actually reduced the efficiency of the coupling by approximately 8%. It was a brilliant kind of sabotage, Just different enough to suggest original innovation. Just complicated enough to seem like the work of a credentialed engineer. Just slightly worse to ensure that the original designer couldn't point to superior performance as evidence of her authorship. Did she fight it? I asked. She tried, Robert said. She went to her supervisor. She tried to explain that she was the one who'd invented it. But she was a young Chinese woman working in a factory. Nobody listened. Nobody cared. The military-industrial complex had no room for her story. It was easier to accept Patterson's version, a credentialed male engineer solving a critical problem, than to accept that the solution had come from someone on the factory floor, someone outside the system. But there was more. In Dorothy's handwritten journal, pages yellowed with age, filled with careful technical drawings and notes written in both English and Chinese, I found something that changed the narrative entirely. The real strange detail wasn't that Patterson had stolen her credit. It was that Dorothy had known it would happen and she'd done it anyway. One entry, dated August 1940, read, "Today I showed Patterson the coupling. He looked at it for 30 seconds and I could see in his eyes that he understood completely. I knew in that moment that he would take it. I could see the decision forming in his face. But I also know that if he doesn't take it, nothing happens. The design never gets implemented. The pilots keep dying in aircraft that shouldn't fail. So I'm choosing to let him have it. I'm choosing to let my name disappear because the pilots matter more than I do. This is the calculation I'm making. This is the choice I'm living with." Robert's eyes filled with tears when I read that passage aloud. He had obviously read this entry many times before, but hearing it spoken by someone else seemed to activate something in him, a grief that transcended the merely personal and became something almost universal. It was the grief of witnessing injustice, the grief of understanding how systems operate, the grief of recognizing that someone you loved had accepted an unacceptable situation because the alternative was worse. She knew, he said. She understood the system well enough to predict exactly what Patterson would do, and she decided to sacrifice her own recognition because she understood that the barrier to implementation wasn't the design. It was the politics. Patterson had credentials. Patterson had position. Patterson had the kind of name that military committees would listen to. Dorothy had nothing, so she made a deal with herself. She would let him take the credit if it meant the design would save lives. I studied the photograph again, Dorothy standing at her workbench, holding that 50-cent piece of metal, her expression calm and resigned and certain. She was 25 years old in that image, photographed for a newspaper feature that had never run, her moment of recognition stolen before it could even be published. But her hands held the device with absolute confidence. She knew what she'd created, she knew what it would do. She knew she would never receive credit for it, and she had accepted that long before the photograph was taken. "That's the real invention," Robert said. "Not the device, the decision, the choice to let yourself be forgotten so that others could live. That's what my grandmother actually created, and nobody, absolutely nobody, remembers it. Until now. Until you started asking questions. Until someone decided that her story mattered enough to investigate." I asked Robert if Dorothy had ever expressed regret about her choice. "Not publicly," he said, "but in her journal, there are moments where you can feel the weight of what she was carrying, moments where the acceptance breaks down and you see the pain underneath. But she never wavered in her commitment to the choice she'd made. She believed that impact was worth more than credit. She lived that belief every single day for the rest of her life. Finding the truth about Dorothy Chen required me to reconstruct a narrative that the aerospace industry had actively worked to erase. I contacted historians at the Smithsonian. I reached out to engineers who had worked at Lockheed during the war years. I obtained declassified military documents related to aircraft safety protocols. I interviewed the last surviving members of the engineering teams that had implemented the fuel line coupling. And what emerged was a story of deliberate institutional amnesia, a system that had benefited from Dorothy's innovation, but had been unwilling to acknowledge her role in creating it. The erasure had been so complete, so systematic, that it had become the official historical record. Generations of aerospace historians had cited Patterson as the innovator, without ever questioning whether he deserved the credit. The fuel line coupling patent became one of the most widely implemented safety features in American military aircraft. It was used in P-51 Mustangs, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-29 Super Fortresses, and countless other aircraft that formed the backbone of American air power during World War II. The design saved lives by preventing fuel line ruptures during the extreme G-forces generated by combat maneuvers, evasive actions, and emergency procedures. Pilots who would have died in burning aircraft lived because a young woman on a factory floor had solved a problem that nobody else could solve. But here's the crucial detail. The patent was credited to Dr. James Patterson. The official histories of Lockheed Aircraft listed Patterson as the innovator. The engineering textbooks reference the Patterson fuel line coupling as a breakthrough in aircraft safety design. Military memoranda discussing the implementation of the technology referred to Patterson's contribution, and Dorothy Chen was erased so completely that when I searched the historical record I found almost nothing, until I found the engineers who had been working under Patterson during that period. I conducted a series of interviews with men, now in their 90s, who had been junior engineers in the Lockheed Design Division during 1940. Their testimonies were consistent and clear. They had all known that the coupling design came from Dorothy Chen. Patterson had brought it to them already complete, already tested, already proven effective. They had assumed at the time that Patterson had simply recognized brilliant work and brought it into the official process. It wasn't until after the war, when the engineers compared notes and reflected on what had happened, that they realized the full extent of what had occurred. Patterson took it and made it his, one engineer told me, his voice still carrying anger after 70 years. We knew it, we all knew it, but what were we going to do? The design was out there. It was saving lives. Going backward, trying to give credit to someone else, fighting the institutional narrative, it would have just created chaos. So we kept quiet. We participated in the erasure by our silence. That's something I've regretted every day since. His name was Samuel Rothstein, and he had been a junior stress analyst on Patterson's team. He was 94 years old when I interviewed him, living in a care facility in Pasadena, his mind still sharp despite his body's deterioration. He had kept detailed notes from his work in 1940, and he showed me engineering sketches with Dorothy's name written in the margins, small notations that suggested she had been collaborating on the design, offering suggestions, helping troubleshoot problems. She'd come to the engineering division at night sometimes, Samuel told me. Officially, she wasn't supposed to be there. Factory workers didn't belong in the engineering spaces, but Patterson allowed it because he recognized her brilliance. She would look at the designs we were working on, and she'd point out stress issues we hadn't considered. She'd suggest modifications, and we'd implement them because they worked. We all knew that the coupling design came from her, but when it came time to submit it officially, Patterson's name went on it, and we didn't have the courage to object. I found Dr. Patterson's personal papers at Stanford University, archived in a collection that had been largely forgotten. There were letters, technical notes, journal entries written in the hand of a man consumed by his own deceptions. One entry, dated 1952, read, "The coupling continues to be implemented. I receive congratulations for its design. I accept them knowing they belong to someone else. The lie has become institutional now. Too many people benefit from the false narrative. Too many careers have been built on my theft. I cannot undo it without destroying everything. So I carry the knowledge of what I've done, and I add it to the weight I already carry." Another entry from 1958 was even more revealing. "I saw her in the hallway today. Dorothy. She's older now, graying, but I recognized her immediately. She was walking toward the women's washroom carrying sketches. Still designing, still creating, still invisible. I tried to make eye contact, hoping perhaps to communicate something. Apology, recognition, acknowledgement. But she looked right through me. I think she's learned not to see people like me. People who steal from her, I deserve it." Patterson died in 1967, taking his knowledge of the theft with him, but not before writing one final letter, dated 3 days before his death, which was discovered among his papers. It was addressed to Dorothy Chen, though there was no indication that it was ever sent. "Dear Dorothy, If you're reading this, I'm dead, and I'm finally ready to face what I did. I took your innovation. I took your contribution. I built a career on your genius while you remained invisible. I've told myself for 30 years that I did it for the sake of implementation, that your name would have prevented the design from being adopted, that the politics of the time required a credentialed male name on the patent. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. I think I did it because I wanted the credit, because I was ambitious, because the system made it easy to steal from you and call it something else. I'm sorry. I know that's insufficient. I know that words, even on my deathbed, cannot restore what was taken. But I needed to say it. I needed to acknowledge finally that the life I built was constructed on a foundation of theft. By then, Dorothy Chen had already disappeared from public record. She had married, changed her name, moved away from California, lived a quiet life away from the aerospace industry. She had never publicly claimed credit for the invention. She had never written about it. She had allowed herself to be forgotten because that was the choice she had made in 1940. I eventually found Dorothy's descendants through genealogical records. Her granddaughter, Patricia, now 87 years old, confirmed what I had suspected. Dorothy had been asked multiple times over the decades if she wanted to come forward to claim credit for the innovation that bore another man's name. Every single time, she had refused. She told me once, Patricia said, that claiming credit would have meant reopening a wound that had finally healed. It would have meant forcing the aerospace industry and the military to acknowledge that they had benefited from the work of a woman they would never have credited if her name had appeared on the patent. She said the pilots were alive. That was the victory. Anything else was just ego, and she didn't have room for ego anymore. I asked Patricia if Dorothy had ever felt bitterness about what happened. She felt something, Patricia said carefully. Not bitterness, maybe, but a kind of sorrow. A knowledge that the world hadn't been built in a way that could acknowledge people like her. That systems of power required certain kinds of people to be invisible. She accepted that. She made peace with it. But I don't think she was ever happy about it. Dorothy Chen was born in 1915 in San Francisco, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had come to America carrying almost nothing except determination and the belief that their children would have opportunities they had never had. Her father, Chen Wei, worked as a laborer in the docks. His hands were scarred from years of handling cargo, his back bent from the physical demands of work that had no mercy for aging bodies. He had come to America as a young man, believing that hard work would transform his circumstances, would create possibilities for his family. He learned quickly that being Chinese in America meant that hard work was a necessity for survival, but not a sufficient condition for success. He learned the language slowly, learned to navigate a system that was designed to exclude him, learned to accept that his children would have a different kind of future than he could create for himself. Her mother, Liu Mei, took in sewing from wealthy American families, working late into the night with her fingers flying across fabric, creating beauty that other people would wear and other people would claim credit for. She had been trained in embroidery in China, in the delicate art of creating patterns that took weeks of work, and would eventually be worn by women who didn't know and didn't care about the hands that had created the beauty they wore. Dorothy grew up watching her mother's hands work. She learned patience. She learned precision. She learned that invisible labor was still labor, that contributions could be erased by systems of power, and that sometimes you had to create value for others and accept that you would never receive recognition for it. But Dorothy had something that her parents didn't have: access to education. Her parents sacrificed everything so that she could attend public school. They worked double shifts. They took on additional jobs. They lived in poverty so that their daughter could attend a school where she would learn not just language and arithmetic, but the possibility that her life could be different. Dorothy was brilliant with mathematics. She understood mechanics intuitively. She could look at a problem and see the solution before it was obvious. By the time she was 14, her teachers were telling her that she could become an engineer, that she had the kind of mind that was wasted in factory work or domestic service. But Dorothy was also Chinese, and Chinese women in 1930s America were not encouraged to become engineers. They were encouraged to become wives, mothers, workers in positions that required no credentials, no recognition, no future beyond the immediate moment. The doors that opened for brilliant white boys remained firmly closed for brilliant Chinese girls. High school counselors suggested she consider secretarial work. University applications to engineering programs were rejected with polite letters that suggested she might be better suited to other fields. The system made it clear, your intelligence is not welcome here. Your ambition is not welcome here. Your future is predetermined. She graduated high school in 1932 in the middle of the Depression. There were no engineering schools that would accept her. There were no companies that would hire a Chinese woman as an engineer. So Dorothy did what millions of women and minorities did during that era. She worked. She took jobs in factories, in textile mills, in assembly plants. She worked nights so she could attend night school. She taught herself engineering by reading books she found in the public library, by studying aircraft design on her own time, by becoming an autodidact in a field that was determined to exclude her. She read everything she could find: aviation journals, engineering textbooks, military specifications, patent filings. She taught herself the mathematics of aerodynamics, the principles of structural design, the physics that governed how aircraft behaved under stress. She did this work in the margins of her life, in the early morning hours before her factory shift, during lunch breaks, late into the night after 8 hours of physical labor. She built a comprehensive education in aerospace engineering without ever setting foot in a university. In 1939, as the possibility of American involvement in World War II grew increasingly likely, the aircraft industry began hiring. There was a massive expansion at Lockheed, at Douglas, at other defense contractors in Southern California. They needed workers. They didn't particularly care who those workers were, as long as they could do the job. Dorothy applied to Lockheed and was hired as a factory assembler. She was 24 years old. For the first time in her life, she was going to work on aircraft. The factory floor at Lockheed was a universe unto itself, a world of noise and heat, and the focused intensity of hundreds of workers assembling aircraft for a war that most of them were terrified they would eventually have to fight. Dorothy moved through that world like someone who had finally found her place. She understood the mechanics instantly. She understood how parts fit together, how tolerances mattered, how a mistake of a millimeter could cascade into disaster. She began suggesting improvements to assembly processes. She began identifying inefficiencies. She began asking questions about design choices that didn't make sense to her. Her supervisors, at first irritated by her input, began to realize that she was usually right. She began thinking about a problem that was consuming the aircraft industry: fuel line failures. During the Spanish Civil War, pilots flying aircraft donated by Germany and Italy had reported problems with fuel lines rupturing during combat maneuvers. The issue persisted when aircraft were tested for more extreme conditions. The G-forces generated during certain maneuvers could cause fuel lines to fail, leading to leaks, fires, engine failures. It was a problem that didn't have an obvious solution. Engineers had been working on it for years. Nothing had worked. The industry accepted the problem as something that pilots would just have to live with, or die with. But Dorothy understood the problem from a different angle. She wasn't constrained by conventional engineering wisdom. She didn't have years of formal training telling her what was possible and what wasn't. She just had a brilliant mind and access to the factory floor where aircraft were built. So she began experimenting with scraps during her breaks, sketching calculations on the backs of production forms, thinking through the physics problem that had defeated credentialed engineers. She used scrap metal from the factory. She studied the stress points in existing fuel lines. She understood that the problem wasn't the line itself, but the coupling, the point where the line connected to the engine. A traditional coupling was rigid. It couldn't absorb the kind of force generated by extreme maneuvers. So Dorothy designed a coupling that could flex, just slightly, just enough to absorb stress without compromising the seal. It was elegant. It was simple. It was beautiful in the way that all perfect solutions are beautiful. She built a prototype using materials that cost less than 50 cents. She tested it informally, asking favors from engineers who understood that she was doing something extraordinary, but couldn't publicly support her because of who she was. The prototype worked. It outperformed every other solution that had been attempted. And then she showed it to Dr. James Patterson, and everything changed. Dorothy kept her journal hidden in a small leather case beneath a loose floorboard in the apartment she shared with 3 other factory workers in Burbank. The apartment was cramped. 4 women living in a space meant for 2, sharing 1 bathroom, cooking in a kitchenette that barely accommodated 2 people at a time. But it was cheap, and it was close to the factory, and it was a refuge from the larger world that told her she didn't belong anywhere. The other women were kind to her mostly, factory workers like her, immigrants like her, people struggling to make lives in a system that wasn't designed for them to succeed. They didn't ask questions about her journal. They understood that everyone needed some private space, some way to process the contradictions of their existence. The journal was written in 2 languages, English and Mandarin Chinese, as if she were speaking to an audience that might exist only in her imagination. She wrote about the calculations she'd made, the stress tests she'd run, the moment when she understood that the coupling design was perfect. She wrote about watching Patterson take it from her. She wrote about the calculations she'd made, recognition versus lives. She wrote to her mother, even though her mother would never read these words. She wrote to her future children, even though she would never have any. She wrote to history, hoping that someone someday would care enough to listen. One entry, written on the night Patterson took the prototype to the engineering division, read, "Today, I became invisible. This is what it feels like. It feels like power and powerlessness at the same time. I created something extraordinary, and I gave it away. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. Because the alternative, fighting for credit, claiming what was mine, forcing the system to acknowledge me, would have taken energy and time and political capital that I don't have and will never have. So instead, I became nothing. I turned myself into a ghost so that the design could live." My mother would understand this choice. She's been making it her whole life, making beautiful things with her hands, and other people wearing those beautiful things, and her name never appearing anywhere. I'm becoming my mother. I'm learning the skill of disappearing for the sake of something larger than myself. Dorothy continued working at Lockheed for the duration of the war. She watched the fuel line coupling be implemented. She read the technical reports about its effectiveness. She saw the military memoranda crediting the Patterson design. She attended meetings where engineers discussed her creation, never mentioning her name, never knowing that she was in the room, watching them benefit from her work. She accepted their invisibility of her the way one accepts a chronic pain, as a permanent condition of the body that you have to learn to live with. But she also started something else. She began mentoring other factory workers who showed interest in engineering. She worked with women, particularly other Asian women, teaching them the mechanics and mathematics that formal education had denied them. She became a self-appointed educator, creating opportunities for people like her to develop their minds, to understand that they were capable of creating things that the world said they couldn't create. She did this work without recognition, without compensation, without expecting anything in return. One of those workers was a young woman named Alice Huang. Alice had come to America from Taiwan only 2 years before, and she spoke almost no English. But she had a gift for understanding how things worked. Dorothy took her under her wing, teaching her in a mixture of English and Chinese, showing her the fundamentals of aircraft design, helping her see that she too could solve problems that credentialed engineers couldn't solve. Dorothy would sit with me during lunch breaks, Alice recalled in an interview conducted when she was in her 80s, and she would teach me mathematics. Not the basics. I knew basic arithmetic, but the mathematics of engineering. She would draw diagrams on paper, showing me how stress worked, how materials behaved under pressure. She never made me feel stupid. She never suggested that I couldn't understand complex concepts. She just assumed I could, and she taught accordingly. I learned more from Dorothy in 6 months than I would have learned in 4 years of formal schooling. Alice would later become an engineer, not through official channels, but through determination and the education that Dorothy had given her. Alice would contribute to aircraft design improvements during and after the war. Alice would have a career that Dorothy herself had been denied. And Alice would always credit Dorothy as her mentor, the woman who had taught her that intelligence and capability didn't require credentials, only application and courage. Dorothy told me something I've never forgotten, Alice said in the same interview. She said, The system will try to erase you. It will take your work. It will give credit to someone else. But it can only erase you if you allow yourself to disappear. So you have a choice. Fight the system and waste your energy on recognition, or build something that outlasts the system itself. I chose to build. I built knowledge in other people. That's harder to erase. Dorothy never married. She never had children. Her entire life was dedicated to the work, both to the aircraft design itself and to the mentorship of others who the system had determined were invisible. She worked at Lockheed until 1960, when she retired at the age of 45. She had never received public credit for the fuel line coupling. She had never become famous. She had never appeared in the history books or the technical journals or the official records of aviation innovation. But she had changed the war. She had saved 2,100 lives. She had created opportunities for dozens of other people. She had built something that outlasted her, not just the physical design, but the knowledge she'd passed on, the people she'd mentored, the transformation she'd created in other people's understanding of what was possible. In a 1962 letter to Alice Huang, Dorothy wrote, "I've been thinking about legacy. I think I used to believe that legacy was about having your name attached to something. But I understand now that the most important legacies are the ones that can't be traced to a single name. They're the ideas that got into people's minds. They're the confidence you gave someone to believe they could do something they weren't supposed to be able to do. They're the future that people build, because you showed them it was possible. That's what I'm leaving behind. Not the coupling, the permission for others to create." She lived simply. She saved her money. She moved to a small house in Burbank and spent her retirement years reading, reflecting, and occasionally meeting with the people she had mentored, now successful engineers in their own right, building on the foundation she had given them. The Smithsonian Institution's decision to recognize Dorothy Chen came fittingly after her death. I had spent 18 months compiling the documentation, the patent records, the engineering testimonies, the military memoranda, the journal entries, the interviews with the people she had mentored. I had traced the path of the fuel line coupling from her hands to its implementation in every major American aircraft of World War II and beyond. I had calculated the probable number of lives saved. I had gathered the evidence that the history books had refused to acknowledge. The process of documentation had been meticulous and emotionally exhausting. I had interviewed engineers in their 90s, racing against time, understanding that every day brought the possibility that crucial witnesses would pass away, taking their memories with them. I had tracked down archival materials that had been scattered across the country. I had obtained declassified military documents through Freedom of Information Act requests. I had built a case so comprehensive and so ironclad that it became impossible for the historical record to remain unchanged. And I had made a case to the Smithsonian. Dorothy Chen deserved recognition, not as a footnote to Dr. James Patterson's achievement, but as the primary innovator of one of the most important aircraft safety features in military aviation history. The museum agreed. In 2001, 38 years after Dorothy's death, an exhibit was created. It featured her photograph from 1940, the original prototype of the fuel line coupling, her handwritten patent application, her journal, and the testimonies of the people she had mentored. The exhibit was titled, "Invisible Genius, Dorothy Chen and the Innovation Nobody Acknowledged." It was a modest exhibit, placed in a wing of the American Aviation Museum that doesn't get extensive foot traffic. But it was there. The historical record was corrected. Dorothy's name was finally attached to her creation. The erasure after 70 years was partially reversed. The opening of the exhibit drew attention from the aerospace industry, from women's organizations, from journalists interested in stories of historical injustice corrected. The New York Times ran a feature. NPR produced a segment. Engineering schools began assigning Dorothy's story in their ethics courses. The woman who had deliberately made herself invisible became, paradoxically, visible through the very act of telling the truth about her invisibility. I received a letter from Patricia, Dorothy's granddaughter, after she'd visited the exhibit. She wrote, "My grandmother once told me that she'd made peace with being forgotten. She'd accepted it as the price of her choices. But seeing her name on a plaque in the Smithsonian, seeing it in the official record, it breaks that peace. It means that she was right all along. Her work did matter. The system was wrong to erase her, and now finally, at least some people know that. I wish she could have known this. I wish she could have seen her name finally acknowledged. I wish she could have understood that her sacrifice wasn't permanent, that the truth eventually finds its way back into the light. But there was more to the story than simple recognition. The act of correcting the historical record had consequences that rippled forward into the present. Young women in STEM fields began researching Dorothy's history. Engineers cited her as an example of innovation emerging from unexpected sources. Scientists studying the sociology of innovation began using Dorothy's story to illustrate how systems of power create barriers that prevent certain voices from being heard. Her invisibility became a case study in how institutional bias operates, how credit gets allocated, how contributions get erased. Universities began developing curriculum around Dorothy's story. Business schools used her case as an example of ethical failures in institutional systems. Diversity and inclusion programs referenced her as evidence of what was lost when systems excluded people based on identity rather than merit. She became an icon not just of historical injustice, but of the possibility of correction, of the power of documentation, of the importance of refusing to let certain stories disappear. Most importantly, other women and minorities began to be recognized for their contributions to the war effort. Dorothy's story opened a door. After her recognition, the Smithsonian began investigating other forgotten innovations, inventions created by women and minorities and factory workers that had been credited to men with credentials and names that carried weight. Some of those stories were recovered. Some innovations that had been attributed to famous male engineers were revealed to have been created by people whose names should have appeared on the patents all along. The fuel line coupling became more than just a technical achievement. It became a symbol of erasure and recovery, of the way that history can be corrected, of the importance of documentation and remembrance. Military history courses began including Dorothy's story. Engineering schools cited her as an example of how formal credentials don't determine capability or innovation. She entered the textbooks 70 years after her invention, because someone had refused to let her disappear completely. Robert Chen had passed away before the Smithsonian recognition was finalized, but his children continued his work, expanding the documentation, ensuring that Dorothy's legacy would continue to grow. His daughter, Jennifer Chen Wu, became a historian specializing in the contributions of Asian Americans to American technology development. She wrote a dissertation on Dorothy's work. She published articles in academic journals. She ensured that the story her great-grandmother had tried to keep quiet would eventually reach audiences who had been hungry for it all along. My great-grandmother understood something fundamental about power and recognition, Jennifer wrote in an essay published in a journal of technology history. She understood that the system that awarded credit also determined whose work mattered. She understood that fighting for recognition within that system was a losing battle for people like her. So instead of fighting within the system, she chose to build outside it. She built knowledge. She built relationships. She built a legacy that couldn't be contained by institutional categories. In the end, the system had to acknowledge her, not because she fought for acknowledgement, but because the evidence of her work became impossible to ignore. I visited Robert Chen at his home in Los Angeles before he passed away, and he showed me the original prototype one more time. He held it in his hands with the same reverence that his grandmother had held it with 80 years before. His hands had arthritis by then. Age and a lifetime of working with his hands had taken their toll, but he held the coupling steady, turning it slowly, showing me the precise joints, the elegant simplicity of the design. She knew, he said for what must have been the 100th time. She always knew that what she'd created mattered. She didn't need the Smithsonian to tell her that. She didn't need the world to acknowledge it. She knew because she understood engineering. She understood that the device would save lives. That was enough for her. But I think it would have mattered to her, knowing that her granddaughter could work in a field where her contributions wouldn't be automatically erased, where women and people of color are beginning to be recognized for their innovations. She sacrificed her recognition so that the innovation could be implemented, but she also, in sacrificing her recognition, created the conditions that would eventually demand that recognition be corrected. The photograph from 1940 now hangs in the Smithsonian, displayed in the Invisible Genius exhibit alongside the fuel line coupling and Dorothy's journal and patent applications. It hangs in a place of honor, framed behind protective glass, lit by museum-quality lighting that reveals every detail of the image while protecting it from further deterioration. Visitors pause before it. They read the placard. They understand finally that Dorothy Chen wasn't just a factory worker who had an idea. She was a brilliant engineer, a problem solver, an innovator who should have been credited alongside the greatest minds in aerospace engineering. The photograph becomes not just a historical artifact, but a moral document, evidence of a system that erased contributions, and a woman who accepted that erasure to save lives. I stand before it sometimes and just look at it. The young woman in factory coveralls holding a 50-cent piece of metal. Her hands are steady. Her expression is calm. She looks like she knows exactly what she's holding and what it will become. And I think about all the moments in history where genius emerged from unexpected places, where the solution to an unsolvable problem came from someone the system had deemed insignificant, where credit was given to the wrong person and remained given to that wrong person for decades. The photograph is ordinary. It's just a snapshot from a newspaper feature that never ran. But it's also extraordinary. It's a document of a moment when a young woman stood at the intersection of engineering and invisibility and made a choice. The choice to create. The choice to give her creation away. The choice to accept the erasure that would follow. The choice to let someone else carry her name into history. There are thousands of these moments in history. Thousands of people whose names are missing from the records, whose contributions have been erased, whose choices to sacrifice recognition for impact have been forgotten. Dorothy Chen's story became visible only because I found a photograph. Someone else might have found a different photograph and uncovered a different erasure. The archive is full of these stories, waiting, patient, hoping that someone will pay attention. Someone will care enough to excavate the truth that the official record has buried. Museums have begun creating entire wings dedicated to invisible contributions. Universities have established fellowship programs named after Dorothy Chen, designed specifically to support women and minorities in STEM fields who might otherwise be overlooked. The fuel line coupling, which had been standard equipment in aircraft for over 80 years, is now referenced in introductory engineering courses as the Dorothy Chen coupling, a small but meaningful recognition of her authorship. Dorothy's granddaughter Alice Huang gave me the last piece of information I needed. She told me that Dorothy had a motto. She'd written it in the margins of her journal, repeated it multiple times across the decades. Create for impact, not for credit. The work will outlast your name. The impact will outlast the institutions that tried to erase you. Those words should be engraved somewhere. They should be on a plaque. They should be quoted in classes. They should be spoken as a kind of prayer for everyone working to solve problems in systems that are determined not to acknowledge their contributions. They should be taught in schools, repeated in boardrooms, understood as a fundamental principle of work done with integrity. The photograph shows a moment before the erasure was complete. It shows Dorothy Chen holding her creation, still visible, still present, still known by the people around her, to be the creator of what would later be stolen from her. The photograph is proof that she existed, that she created, that she mattered, that she knew what she'd made would save lives, even if the world would never know she'd made it. The photo survived. The innovation survived. The impact survived. And now finally, after 70 years of silence, the story survives too. Dorothy Chen is no longer invisible. Not completely. Not anymore. Not since someone decided that her story was worth investigating, worth documenting, worth insisting upon until the historical record itself was transformed. And that 50-cent piece of metal? It has saved 2,100 lives and counting because the coupling is still in use, still protecting pilots, still functioning as testimony to a woman who chose impact over credit, connection over recognition, and history over the erasure that tried to claim her. Subsequent aircraft designs have incorporated improvements to the coupling, but the fundamental principle Dorothy developed remains: flexibility under pressure, maintaining integrity under extreme G-forces, protecting the system that depends on it. Some legacies are measured in names. Some are measured in lives saved. Dorothy Chen's is measured both ways now. And that, finally, is what she deserves. That, finally, is enough. The photograph remains on display. The story continues to spread. And somewhere in the archive of human possibility, a young woman stands at a workbench in 1940, holding a 50-cent piece of metal, knowing that the world will forget her, but understanding that the lives saved will remember her forever, even if they never know her name.